Your rescue dog flinches at a sound you barely noticed. A door closing, a raised hand, a stranger's footstep down the hall. Most people call it anxiety. Some call it trauma. Most assume it fades once the dog feels safe and loved. But neuroscience tells a completely different story. What is happening inside your rescue dog's brain is not a memory problem. It is a structural one. Their brain has been physically rewired by what they survived, down to the neural level. And what happens next? What science has discovered about whether that can ever actually change? Most rescue owners never get told. When your rescue dog flinches at a raised hand, that is not a bad memory surfacing. That is neurobiology in real time. Inside every dog's brain, there are two regions that shape almost everything about how they respond to fear. The first is the amygdala, the brain's alarm system. It detects threats and fires faster than conscious thought ever could. The second is the prefrontal cortex, the brake. It evaluates the situation and tells the amygdala when to stand down. In dogs raised in stable homes from puppyhood, these two systems develop in balance. They work together the way they are supposed to. In dogs who experience neglect, abuse, or abandonment early in life, that balance never forms. The amygdala overdevelops instead. Repeated early stress floods the developing brain with cortisol. The amygdala becomes larger, more reactive, and much harder to quiet. At the same time, the prefrontal cortex, the part that is supposed to say, "Wait, this is safe," becomes underactive. The brake stops working. The alarm runs almost constantly, without a reliable way to shut it off. This is why your rescue dog reacts to a door slamming, a hand moving too quickly, or a slightly raised voice. Their brain is not processing those as new information. It is processing them as known danger, because that is what it learned. A 2019 study in Frontiers in Veterinary Science found that dogs with early trauma histories showed measurably different stress response patterns. Even after months in completely safe environments, their neural baseline looked nothing like dogs without histories of abuse or neglect. Their body was somewhere safe. Their brain was still somewhere else entirely. Think of it like a smoke detector that was damaged. It goes off at steam from a kettle, not just fire. It is not malfunctioning for no reason. It is doing exactly what it was trained to do, just in the wrong context now. This is why so many rescue owners feel confused. The dog is safe. The dog is loved. But the fear is still there. And that confusion is understandable. Because we expect behavior to change when the situation changes. But the brain does not work that way. Especially a brain that was shaped during a critical developmental window, before the dog understood what a permanent, safe home could feel like. The behaviors you see are not signs that your rescue dog is broken or beyond help. They are signs that their nervous system is still working exactly as it was built to. Understanding this does not just change how you feel about your rescue dog. It changes what you actually do around them every single day. The way you enter a room, the way you reach out your hand, the tone you use when you call their name. All of it is data. And their brain is reading every single piece of it. This is not stubbornness. This is not a failure to bond. This is a brain built for survival, slowly learning something entirely new. Because if the answer is no, if trauma is permanent and fixed, then loving a rescue dog is just managing a wound that never heals. But if the answer is yes, if the brain can change, then every patient moment you offer your dog is not just kindness. It is medicine. And the science, it turns out, has been building a very clear answer for years now. To understand what trauma actually does to a dog's body, you need to know about one system in particular. It is called the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. It sounds complicated, but what it does is simple. When the brain detects a threat, it triggers a chain reaction. The hypothalamus signals the pituitary, which signals the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands release cortisol. Cortisol floods the body and prepares it for one thing: survival. Heart rate spikes. Digestion slows. Muscles tighten. The senses sharpen. Every available resource redirects toward either fighting or fleeing. In a healthy system, once the threat passes, cortisol levels drop. The body resets. The dog relaxes and moves on. In dogs with trauma histories, that reset does not happen cleanly. The system stays calibrated at a permanently higher baseline level of alert. Researchers have found that rescue dogs with documented histories of abuse or neglect carry cortisol baselines measurably higher than other dogs. Not just slightly higher. In some studies, the difference reached nearly 40% above the baseline seen in non-traumatized dogs. And here's the part that surprises most people: that elevated baseline does not disappear just because the dog is now in a safe home. Weeks pass. Months pass. The environment is warm and consistent. And still, the baseline cortisol remains stubbornly, persistently elevated. Because the HPA axis has been recalibrated by experience. It no longer knows what a normal, unthreatened state actually feels like. Imagine a thermostat installed in a house that was always cold. It learned to keep the heat running constantly just in case. Now it is in a warm house. But no one told it the cold is gone. So it keeps running anyway. That is what living with chronically elevated cortisol looks like in a rescue dog. Always slightly on. Always slightly ready to run. And chronic cortisol has real consequences. It disrupts digestion. It suppresses the immune system. It interferes with deep, restorative sleep. Most importantly for you, it makes learning significantly harder. Cortisol directly impairs memory formation and the brain's capacity to build new associations. This is why training a rescue dog often feels like 2 steps forward and 1 step back. It is not stubbornness or a lack of intelligence. Their brain is operating under a chemical load that makes absorbing and retaining new information genuinely more difficult than it is for other dogs. And the frustrating part is that the dog has no control over this. They are not choosing to forget. They are not choosing to resist. They are working 3 times as hard just to stay present in a moment their nervous system keeps flagging as unsafe. So the question rescue owners often ask, how long until my dog trusts me? Is really a question about cortisol. How long until the HPA axis recalibrates? How long until the body's baseline shifts from survival mode to something closer to peace? The answer depends on something that turns out to be one of the most remarkable properties of the brain, its ability to change. Not reshaped by time alone. Not reshaped by safety alone. But by something science is only beginning to fully understand and measure. The word neuroplasticity gets used a lot these days. But what it actually means at a physical level is what matters here. It means the brain is not a fixed structure. It is not set in stone after puppyhood or after trauma. It can reorganize. Neurons that fire together wire together. That is not a metaphor. Every repeated experience physically strengthens the neural pathways associated with it. For a dog who grew up afraid, the pathways associated with fear are thick, fast, and deeply ingrained. They fire instantly and reliably. But those pathways are not permanent. Every calm, safe, consistent interaction with you is quietly building something new alongside them. A 2021 study from the University of Helsinki followed rescue dogs placed in new homes over a period of 12 to 18 months. Dogs whose owners reported consistent, low-pressure environments with predictable routines showed measurable reductions in their fear response baselines over that period. In many cases, the markers of their stress response, cortisol levels, heart rate reactivity, nearly matched dogs with no trauma history at all. Not similar. Not almost improved. Nearly identical to a dog that had never experienced trauma. The brain had actually changed. Here is what that looks like in real life. Your rescue dog used to freeze every time you reached toward their collar. You reach slowly every time. You pair the gesture with something good. You never rush. You never punish the freeze. You just stay consistent. One day, 6 months in, maybe 12, they don't freeze. They lift their chin slightly. They let you reach without bracing. That is not them getting used to you. That is a new neural pathway forming. That is neuroplasticity in a rescue dog. The amygdala's response to that gesture has been downregulated by safe repetition. The old pathway is not gone, but a new one is stronger. And that new pathway was built entirely by you. By the way you moved. By the patience you offered when most people would have rushed. This is also why punishment-based training is so specifically harmful for rescue dogs. Their amygdala is already hyperactive. Adding punishment activates the same fear circuitry that trauma already built, and makes those pathways stronger, not weaker. What builds new pathways is the opposite: safety, repetition, and reward. Not the reward for performing. The reward of simply feeling safe. That the hand that reaches for you has never once hurt you. That the voice that calls your name always means something good is coming. Over time, those repeated experiences are not just behavioral. They are neurological. They are rewriting the architecture of fear inside your dog's brain. You are not just giving your rescue dog a home. You are literally rewiring their brain. And the timeline is real. It is not instant. It is not 3 weeks or 1 good month. It takes the time it takes. But the direction, if the environment is safe and consistent, is almost always forward. The brain wants to heal. You just have to give it the conditions. And the time. And the patience to let it move at its own pace. Because the dog that flinched in week 1, that slept pressed against the wall, that refused treats from strangers, that dog is still here. But so is the one who is slowly, carefully, neurologically learning that here, with you, is the safest place in the world. Go back to that moment. The one at the beginning. Your rescue dog flinching at a sound you barely noticed. You understand it differently now. Not as anxiety. Not as a personality flaw. As a brain built by pain, by abandonment, to protect itself, a brain that learned the world was not safe. That people were not reliable. That love was not something you could count on. And then you came along. And you did the work. Not the dramatic work. Not one heroic moment. But the quiet, repeated, daily work. The slow reach. The consistent routine. The voice that never raised itself in fear. The presence that always meant the same thing. Safe. That is what neuroplasticity runs on. Not grand gestures. Consistency. Patience. The willingness to show up the same way again and again. And every single time you did that, every morning you sat quietly while they ate, every evening you let them approach on their own terms, you were not just being kind. You were participating in a neurological event. You were building new architecture in a brain that knew only fear. A study out of Austria found that rescue dogs with the biggest cortisol reductions after 12 months all had one thing in common. Their owners scored highest on calm consistency. Not intensity of affection. Not frequency of training sessions. Calm. Consistent. Predictable. Present. Your dog does not need you to be perfect. They need you to be the same. Every day. In every small moment. The dog that once slept pressed against the farthest wall is now pressed against your leg. That shift did not happen by accident. It happened because you were there. Repeatedly. Reliably. In all the unspectacular moments that neuroplasticity is actually made of. Think about what that means. Not what you did in the biggest moment, but what you kept doing in all the smallest ones. The morning you did not react when they growled at the leash. The afternoon you sat on the floor and just waited. The evening you let them eat first. Each of those moments is a data point. And their brain collected every single one. Filed them. Slowly, carefully updated its model of the world. Updated its model of you. From unknown, to present, to safe, to home. Your rescue dog chose to stay. Every single day, in a world their brain still sometimes reads as dangerous, they chose to stay with you. That is not nothing. That is not small. That is a traumatized brain making a new choice, because you gave it one worth making. If this changed how you see your rescue dog, if it reframed even one small moment, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment below. I want to know, how long did it take your rescue dog to start feeling safe? Tell me one moment you noticed the shift. Those answers matter more than you know. And if you want to understand the exact moment a rescue dog decides to trust you, the precise neurological signal that marks the turning point, that is the next video. And the science behind it is more specific and more moving than you might expect.